Yeah. Well, we are about to start. I think a lot of people are still drinking coffee, but we will need to get started. And it's a pleasure for me to open this symposium and also to introduce the chairman, Larry Seidman, who will also be the first speaker. The whole thing is about new targets for preventing of schizophrenia. It is time for intervention in the pre-morbid phase, and a question mark. Maybe we can have a vote about that in the end. But I will give the floor to Larry Seidman.
Thank you, Maretta. So in this symposium, I'll just take a moment to do a little overview. I'll be speaking about a study, the pilot study that we've been carrying out in Boston that I'll tell you about. Rudolf Uher will be next, and he'll be speaking about an intervention study going on in Canada. Then Nicoline and Camilla from Denmark will be talking about the VIA-7 study and some of the neurocognitive findings there. And then, unfortunately, Dr. Keshavan could not make it, but he's a colleague of mine just down the hall, and so he trusted me with his slides, so hopefully I'll do justice to them. But I think, just to get started, about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, Maretta and I co-edited a special theme issue in Schizophrenia Bulletin. And the idea really is, and this was emphasized also in Ann Thorup's talk this morning, that the high-risk approach, the genetic high-risk or familial high-risk approach, was really initiated by Barbara Fish's study in 1952. And there are at least 30 family high-risk studies done over the last 60 years. And a number of new ones, such as the VIA-7 study, which have tremendous potential to add much more information. I think what's different is that the dream had been, if we can really understand the precursors of illness, in this case psychotic illness, we might be able to intervene and alter that path. And so some of the talks you're going to hear today will focus on that. But I think that's really the direction. Maretta emphasized that as well in one of her slides, where as she was working backwards to younger children, this notion is catching on. Because we know that first episode psychosis, and even the prodrome, is a fairly late phase of a derailment of normal functioning. And the question is, how could we identify people earlier? What would be the targets of intervention? Could they be ethical? So for example, in this paper by Paul Applebaum, he discussed the issues related to the ethics of early intervention when you don't have necessarily a disorder, although, as was emphasized in VIA-7, there are psychiatric disorders in children. And then the question would be, what are the targets? Is the target preventing the illness, or is it something more proximal, like improving functioning, improving cognition, reducing symptoms in the near term? So I think those are the issues that we dealt with in this particular special issue. And you see these papers focused on biological possible interventions with pharmacology. Some of the earlier papers focused on psychosocial interventions. So I'm going to take a little bit of a framework. This is a slide based on a picture in our overview paper. And what we're thinking about is, here is development. So one has to start from a developmental picture. Not just age, but thinking about development as a series of steps in which a newborn develops into an adult over 20-odd years. And this heavy line refers to those at clinical risk. So if we're thinking about the prodromal focus, we know that the conversion rate is somewhere between 20 and 35% over 3 years, depending on the study. The familial risk for psychosis is somewhat lower. It's roughly about 10%. But one of the advantages of a familial high-risk approach is you can select people at any age as offspring of parents and study them. So as in VIA 7, it's 7 years, and in our study, it was also 7 years of age. And in theory, you could intervene if you have good reason to suspect that prenatal complications are a problem in people at familial high risk, and perhaps they get their obstetrical care later, those moms who might have psychotic disorders, then perhaps you might develop specialized programs to help them get better prenatal care earlier, because that's a universal good. That's not, there's nothing adverse in that kind of intervention, and all mothers and all parents want to have good prenatal care, and so on. So the strategy of this kind of approach allows you to pick a sample at a particular time point and investigate. So, and this is a slide from a colleague of mine, Barbara Kornblatt, well known to all of you from the Prodrome. And the general model that we've been thinking about with the onset of psychosis is that as a result of genetics and prenatal complications, the brain is altered in some way, perhaps in all people who develop psychosis, to a greater or lesser extent. That's not proven, but at least that's a hypothetical model. It could be affected at the structural level, at white matter, gray matter. It could be affected only in biochemical systems, and so on. And there's this period as resulting from that of vulnerability, which may not at all go on to develop psychosis, but may go on to develop many other kinds of symptoms, and we're going to tell you about that today. Some people, due to presumed stressful triggers, develop psychosis in adolescence and young adulthood. But one idea is to move the clock back in this sort of strategic thinking. So let's just take a little quick tour through some of the precursors. So we know from the major studies from the Psychiatric Genetics Consortium in particular that there are many genetic paths to schizophrenia. Of these 108 loci, this is in the Nature paper 2014, the large majority of genes that are risk genes for schizophrenia are genes that build the brain, the cytoskeleton. There are genes that are relevant to biochemistry, such as DRD2, which makes sense in terms of dopamine system. But interestingly enough, immune system genes came up as one of the main clusters, and that gives us a clue that maybe, as in talks that you just might have heard, that there are risk vulnerabilities there. And then, of course, there are larger, in a smaller number of people, as opposed to polygenic risk, there are deletions or copies, these copy number variants in the genome that produce bigger kinds of effects. And then there are simply chromosomal abnormalities that, like 22q, that are associated with psychosis and so on. But we know when we're just studying the families clinically, there's an estimate of about a 10-fold increase in risk. And this is all very well known for many years. And the rates increase with 2 parents who are ill with psychosis up to about 30 or 35%, Irving Gottesman showed. And then in identical twins, it's about 50%. So we know that there's a genetic background. What about the environment? This is a slide from Pat Sullivan, one of the main people in the genetics consortium, summarizing the effect sizes. And you see family history is the largest effect size of what you might consider, in this case, family history is a mixture of environment and genes. But we have various obstetric complications. There are other things that happen during pregnancy to the mother. A big topic right now is maternal stress, and in our lab, Cindy Liu has a grant from the NIMH to study maternal stress during pregnancy and then look at newborns and look at the newborns 4 months later. And these are from parents with psychotic disorders or bipolar disorders. So there's a wide range. There's no specific risk factor that explains psychotic disorders. So our strategy in our lab, begun about 30 years ago by Ming Swang and Steve Ferrone, and I was the neuropsychologist and brain imaging person to join them. And I was mainly working with patients with schizophrenia, but their strategy was to look at endophenotypes through relatives. And so we, beginning quite a long time ago, then as part of the COG study, we studied adult relatives in part to try and find markers in unaffected relatives, and that, of course, is a very extensive worldwide effort for many, many years now. We gradually were moving to younger offspring or relatives, and we did a study of adolescents. And now this children's study that we're doing is children 7 to 12 who have a parent with psychosis. And it's a small pilot study from NIH. I've also been working in the Naples study. There will be a paper coming out in about 10 days on the first major results from Naples 2 in neurocognition and JAMA psychiatry. But also I've been part of a cohort study, a pretty famous cohort study in the United States that began in 1959. And we're still mining that database, looking at newborns, children 4 and 7 years old, and so on. So I've been involved in a number of these different paradigms, and I want to maybe summarize very quickly. This is fairly comparable to what Maretta talked about earlier. There are a variety of levels of abnormalities in different systems, whether it's brain, behavior, social, emotional, symptoms, perinatal, and so on. And for example, this is a study that we did in the National Collaborative Perinatal Cohort. Francisca Gama looked at Bailey scales at 8 months of age in offspring for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And what she showed, and she broke these signs up, they were basically motor signs at age 8 months, into those that connoted self-other distinction and others that were more social. And what you can see in the schizophrenia risk group had higher rates, especially than the affective disorder group in a number of different domains. Actually, these are the affective psychoses, not affective psychoses, and then we broke it out into schizophrenia. So, but particularly in the object-related intermodal integration, suggesting some self-other distinctions that they were having trouble with even at 8 months of age. So the assumption is that at least in a subset, there's a neurodevelopmental etiology and that starts very early. So in this study of 7 to 12-year-old children, it's a small study. Of course, I'm very jealous when I hear about VIA-7, and we don't have the kind of registries in the US that exist in Scandinavia, so we're recruiting from the community. And the numbers are 21 children at high risk, 31 controls. The parents, control parents have no family history of psychosis. Children were excluded if they're psychotic, have frank neurological disorders, IQ less than 70. We gave a very extensive and intensive battery of tests, some of which overlap with VIA-7, such as the CBCL and the brief. But we interview the child, we interview the parent. There's a fairly extensive neurocognitive and social cognitive evaluation. The children get MRI, and we're also collecting blood and saliva for hormones and DNA. What we found so far is, first of all, I would say this sample that we've collected is at the very extreme end of the distribution of adversity. because of low SES, of two factors in particular, low social economic status, and even with the data that was presented in VIA 7, where maybe 60 to 70% of those families have two parents, in our sample, only 3 out of 14 families, so about 22%, had two parents in the family. So these were mainly single mothers and mainly poor. They were not different from the controls, and mainly schizophrenia related. We had a number with bipolar with psychosis. They were not different on sex or age, but they were different on SES. And we're going to, some of the data I'm going to show you, which is very hot off the press, we haven't matched one-to-one, and we can do that because we have a larger control sample. But let's see. Yeah, this is, I already mentioned. Also, there were a greater number of children, offspring, in the case families. And so on average, the identified child that we saw who fit into this age group was the 4th child in these families, whereas in the control families, they were the 2nd. So the families are really quite different. And our experience was that these families were under great stress. The mothers were, and fathers were the same age in the two groups, about 32. So at the time we saw them, these children were not offspring of young mothers. Their birth weight was a little lower, 6.9 to 7.6 pounds, and that is significant even with this very small sample. They got to their prenatal care not excessively late, but 7.8 weeks to 6.1 weeks, a trend, but meaningful within a small sample. The rate of cigarette smoking was 5 times higher in the case families. The use of cannabis was much higher during pregnancy in the case families. So these may be a function of a variety of variables, but they're increasing the risk to the offspring. So one question is could we intervene during pregnancy and set up some kind of program to try and improve their prenatal care? I'm just going to show you a little bit of data so far, and that's the CBCL and the brief. And there were dramatic differences even with this very modest sample. I didn't show everything here just for time, but school, social, and measures of competence, which are the summary measures in the CBCL, were all significantly different. And then very dramatically different effects on internalizing and externalizing behavior, significant for affective problems. The mean age here is 9, and it was very evident even on clinical interview that these were kids who had a lot of dyscontrol problems, and this showed up on the brief as well on every single dimension. Actually, the brief is a measure of executive functioning. So the most striking observation at first is simply this impairment in self-regulatory behavior. Now, it's possible that these children are not typical of the high-risk population based on this very, this family structure that we acquired just by chance, which had a lot of adversities. And just to summarize, so poverty, family size, low social support, largely single mothers, low birth weight. We haven't done any of the correlations yet to see how does low birth weight relate to behavior, et cetera, and some of these prenatal adversities. So we see many problems that could be targeted. And just to remind you from the TNRE study that the gene by environment interaction was very clear in that the families in the adopted away offspring that had better functioning overall, even with the risk for schizophrenia, the rate of transition to psychosis was no higher than the controls. So the possibility is that you might be able to prevent psychosis with strong interventions, even only in the psychosocial realm. And then just to close, the logic in this study so far, what we're seeing here is that what we would hope is that if we could improve the prenatal care, that would reduce risk factors. We don't know 20 years later whether those children are going to develop schizophrenia or bipolar or have depression or cognitive problems, but we think just doing that is a non-controversial kind of intervention. When we look at the 7 to 12-year-old children, the kinds of difficulties we're seeing, I think we'll hear some from Rudolf in terms of the kind of interventions that he's got going for children 9 to 19. So anyway, this is a kind of conceptual map for how one could think about intervening early. And just to give some credit to some of my colleagues, Kesh and I were PIs on this study with John Gabrielli at MIT, and we work on many studies together. Steve Ferrone, a longstanding colleague in endophenotypes, Cindy Liu, who's focusing on the prenatal care, and Jessica Blaze, who's working with me on cognition in childhood. So thank you for your attention, and Our plan is to take one question after each talk and then save about 10 minutes at the end. So if anybody has a quick question, we can try that. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next speaker. Okay?
Oh, I could have a quick question. No, I was just wondering. I was just wondering about the prenatal care. I think it's really difficult. I think it's a good idea, of course. No one can be against prenatal care and enhanced prenatal care. But do you know of any evidence or any studies that could help us with regard to what to do?
No. I know there is some literature out there, none with schizophrenia. I mean, there are mother-baby units in a number of places. I don't know if you have in Denmark. I know in the UK. But we've been talking with the obstetrical service at our hospital as to what their thinking might be, because one of the challenges is how do you identify those mothers if they don't bring this to your attention? Do you go through the hospitals? Do you go through the Department of Mental Health? And then exactly what you would do. So one of the simplest things to do would be to ensure in the Department of Mental Health patient registry to see if those people can be identified by their clinician to ensure that they get early care and that that's a very primary focus. Yeah. So.
Thank you. Thank you to Larry. And the next speaker is Rudolf Uher, who is a professor in psychiatry in Dalhousie University in Halifax. Rudolf.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'll be talking about some efforts we've done towards early interventions in high-risk youth. And most of this is based on FORBO, or Families Overcoming Risks and Building Opportunities for Wellbeing study that's ongoing in Halifax, that's Nova Scotia, Canada. Just disclosures, it's all independently funded from competitive grants. This is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about severe mental illness, and what I mean is any of the three diagnoses: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, schizoaffective is also included. And we also require that to fulfill 2 of the 5 severity criteria, so either chronic, recurrent, requiring admission, life-threatening suicide attempts, or hospital admission, and this is or psychotic symptoms. And this is to match really we don't take in mild to moderate depression. We want to match the severity. When we look at these three disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, they are very expensive to the society. They affect individuals to a great degree, they affect families, they affect society. And in Canada, at least, it's been calculated that these three diagnoses cost the society more than all types of cancer combined. And this often surprises people, but the reason for it is because these conditions start early in life, so they affect people for decades, for a very long time. So this is major problem. We need to do something about it. The question is cure or prevent or cure. As psychiatrists, most of what we've been trying to do for many years is to treat or ideally cure mental illness. We've been unsuccessful in the vast majority of cases. We can typically improve the course a little bit, but nothing close to cure in most cases. So many of us are wondering about prevention. What kind of prevention? There's general prevention efforts that may work to an extent, but they typically do not reach the most disadvantaged people at the highest risk. So we also exploring the option of indicated preventions for those at the highest risk. And to do indicated prevention, we need to identify first who needs help and then intervene. So that's the logic I'll follow in the talk. First, early identification of risk. This has long history. For a couple of decades, there has been good research on the at-risk mental state or ultra-high risk or prodrome for schizophrenia and more recently for bipolar disorder. And that there's growing evidence that interventions at this stage are very helpful. And there's also growing evidence that people at this stage are already functionally impaired and affected, and it's been claimed, I think rightly so, that this is already an illness rather than just a risk state. So we're asking if this at-risk state isn't too late and that we may go earlier with interventions, and we are not alone. You have heard Pat McGorris talk about the same direction and others. So we think if we want to make bigger difference in normalizing trajectories of young people at risk, we may need to go substantially earlier than the typical at-risk mental state groups. We need to go into early adolescence or childhood. Larry and Marriott are thinking perhaps early childhood or prenatally, but definitely younger. And we think we can do it. We can predict who is at risk early on. And we just may not be as specific as to focus specifically on schizophrenia. And these efforts will likely be transdiagnostic. And that's part of the reason why I'm talking about severe mental illness rather than one particular diagnosis. The one strategy that we're following is a combination of genetics indexed by family history, affected parents mainly in our case, and something that we call antecedents. Antecedents are early mild conditions of the individual that predict severe mental illness and preceded by a number of years. So we're not looking for something that will predict who will become ill over the next months to a year, but we're looking at something that will predict who may become ill years later so that we have enough time to intervene and change. What we mean by genetic risk at this point, it's family history. We completed a meta-analysis that shows that approximately 1 in 3 sons and daughters of parents with either schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression will develop one of these conditions by early adulthood. The curve actually plateaus as early as age 20. So there's also indication that the onset may be earlier in the family high-risk cases. In exact terms, it's 32%. This number is higher than the 10% that Larry mentioned, and that's because we look at schizophrenia and affective disorders together. we sum them up. And this is at least 2.5 times more than in people who do not have affected parents. So that's too high to leave it. The other part of our risk identification strategy is what we call antecedents. This is how we define an antecedent, and we searched the literature and we found 4 conditions that seem to fit the bill as an antecedent. I will take you through them one by one. The first one is affective flability, or changes of mood that are sudden and out of proportion to what's happening around. So this is not just getting upset when something bad happens. This is mood changes that happen out of context. I put quotes from participants in blue. So a description of someone with affective flability is he often gets grumpy and unhappy quickly and for no apparent reason. We never know what he will be like the next hour. And we measure this using the affective flability scales, and we take parent report in addition to self-report. Affective flability is increased in people with all the diagnoses that I mentioned as severe mental illness, and for some of them it's already been shown that it predicts their onset. So that's why we think it's an antecedent. The second one is anxiety. That's a very established antecedent of definitely depression and bipolar disorder. It's more of a question mark whether it is also an antecedent to schizophrenia or not. Anxiety is very common already in childhood. The typical age of onset of first anxiety disorder is childhood or early adolescence at the latest. It definitely predicts depression and bipolar disorder. We measure it as diagnosis of any anxiety disorder on KD-SATs, and in addition we have SCARED, which is a pretty good questionnaire, both self-report and parent report, that helps us get in the cases that do not fit any one particular diagnosis but have lots of anxiety symptoms across them. The third antecedent are psychotic symptoms. So mostly hallucinations, sometimes delusions, actually common in children. When we ask about them, we hear about them. Auditory hallucinations are the most common. Here is an example again. I kept hearing an evil laugh. I also heard a loud voice at my grandmother's house saying, "Go home," and asked my grandmother, "Did you hear that?" And she responded, "Hear what?" So at the time it happened, the girl believed the voice was real. Otherwise, she wouldn't be asking her grandmother if she heard that. That makes it a psychotic symptoms. That girl does not have schizophrenia or any psychotic disorder because this is relatively transient. But in long-term data, although these symptoms typically resolve, they do predict high risk of psychotic disorders and other disorders, and also suicide attempt. So this is our third. The fourth antecedent, basic symptoms, that's perhaps the least well known. It comes from German psychopathology tradition in the exploration of the earliest stages of psychotic illness. And basic symptoms are very much similar to psychotic symptoms, but they come with immediate insight. When a person experiences a basic symptom, they immediately wonder, what's wrong with me? Not what's wrong with the world. And they can be either loss of function, like the one outlined here, or they can also be perceptual. So if someone feels like they see things differently, different colors slowed, but they don't believe someone changed them, but the reality, but they believe something's wrong with me, that makes it a basic symptom too. The sensitivity and specificity of basic symptoms in the existing longitudinal studies is as high as the at-risk mental state, but the delay is much longer. On average, the delay between basic symptom presenting and the onset of psychotic illness is around 6 years, and that makes them suitable to our design when you're looking for earlier predictors. And we assess them with schizophrenia proneness instrument, which is an interview. I'll tell you something about the cohort, of Forbo cohort. At the moment, we have 300 youth, that's children, adolescents, up to young adulthood. On average, they are 10-year-old when they enter the study. They are 50-50 boys and girls. And we see them every year. So we already completed 670 assessments on the 300 youth. Many of them are sons and daughters of parents with one of the severe mental illnesses, but not all of them. So it's a mixture, and that allows the assessors to be blind. They do not know whether this is a son or daughter of affected parent or a healthy parent. Yeah, this is ongoing. We are about halfway through enrolling into FORBO. This is the split by parent diagnosis. So we have about nearly 70 control offspring. The highest group are offspring of parents with depression, and this is the severe end of depression. 80 offspring of parents with bipolar disorder, and a smaller group, 26 offspring of parents with schizophrenia. These kids are already quite ill when they come in. Mind you, average age 10 years when they come in, and already approximately 1/4 of them have an internalizing disorder, anxiety or depression, and 1/4 of them have diagnosed externalizing disorder, most commonly attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. The antecedents by family history group, all of them are increased in offspring of parents with severe mental illness. Affective lability is increased in all 3 groups, most notably in the offspring of depression and bipolar disorder parent. Anxiety is specifically increased in offspring of parents with mood disorders. We do not yet, with the small numbers, see increase in offspring of parents with schizophrenia. Psychotic symptoms increased in high-risk offspring, basic symptoms increased in high-risk offspring. The overall number of antecedents is actually highest in the small groups of offspring of parents with schizophrenia, and higher in all high-risk groups than in controls. So does this strategy work to identify risk? We are coming to the stage when we can have early data on it. We have 365 follow-up assessment completed on just under 200 kids who did not have one of these diagnoses at baseline, so who are at risk for severe mental illness. And we have pretty good retention rate. 95% of them come back after each year. And we have already had 15 new onsets of severe mental illness. Most of these are onsets of depression, though that may be the initial diagnosis in some cases. There have also been 1 onset of schizophrenia, 2 onsets of bipolar disorder. The first thing you notice, only 1 of them occurred among the 70 controls, so nearly all of them occurred in offspring of parents with severe mental illness. The highest risk is in those who have both parents affected. So I think we only have like 12 of them who had both parents affected, but 3 or 4 of them already got ill, right? So that seems to be a very high-risk group. The other thing you notice, nearly all of them have antecedents. When we divide the cohort by antecedent, overall the incidence rate is 41 per 1,000 person-year follow-ups. In those who did have an antecedent on the baseline or previous year assessment, the rate is 75 per 1,000. In those without antecedent, it's just 6 per 1,000. So that's more than 10-fold difference. Having an antecedent is a good predictor. But what we also see is most of the onsets have actually more than 1 antecedent, and that's definitely not the pattern in the cohort overall. So more than expected, we see this huge gradient. The more of the 4 antecedents they fulfill, the higher is the risk, and the gradient is very steep, actually. And that makes us think that we may need some kind of graded approach to what we do for whom. The interventions that we're doing, they are more based on just any antecedent, yes or no. The plan is for potentially several interventions that may differ by age of the youth. So from age 9 onwards, I think we can focus more on the youth themselves. For the younger kids, we may be focusing more on the parents or families. We may think of nutraceuticals or pharmacological interventions that may work at any age. But we are facing this acceptability challenge, right? These kids are not treatment seeking. They are enrolled through their parents, but they do not come saying, I want help now. So what happens when you give them a call saying, we would like to offer you your daughter, your son to participate in a research study of an intervention that may reduce the risk of mental illness, right? That may evoke very different reactions, typically different reactions in different family members, and this is a cold call that comes unexpected. So there's been another study in Netherlands that took a similar approach. They looked at preventive intervention in offspring of parents with depression or anxiety. And we are quite excited to see this. And then a few years later, we learned that trial was terminated after 30 months. They had about 1,300 potentially eligible individuals, of which 26 agreed to be randomly allocated. So very low acceptability. And they published the paper about why this may be, and fortunately this came out after we started, so we were not deterred by it. But we did things differently. So rather than saying we will treat or prevent to severe mental illness, we approaching people with more something like this. We would like to offer your daughter a course of sessions to strengthen her mental health skills. So we don't do therapy, we do coaching. We coach them in skills. We try to do it outside hospital, etc. And we also tend to do this after the people were in the cohort for at least 2 years, so that they have some relationship with the research staff. We also have a rather innovative design. It's called cohort within trial design, where that allows us, because people, when they're entering the 4-bow cohort, they are asked their consent whether they would be happy for their data to be used to evaluate interventions and to be approached with offers of intervention. Almost everyone says yes to it. And that allows us to actually randomly select people and then only call those that we are actually offering the intervention to. So we do not need to say, we are going to test this wonderful intervention, but you have 50% chance to be allocated to a control group that nobody believes in. And we hope that would help as well. The intervention itself, it's individual youth-focused intervention, one-on-one with a coach who is a clinical psychologist. We can do up to 18 sessions over 3 to 4 months, and the focus is on skill building. There's a common core plus modules that depend on which antecedents they come with. These are the 2 psychologists who are creating and running the intervention, both clinical psychologists, Barbara Pavlova and Alim Awadia. Barbara is creating and supervising it. Alim is administering most of the sessions. This is just an example of the schematization for one of the antecedents. This is for unusual experiences, so it works both for psychotic symptoms and basic symptoms. And we always try to conceptualize the pathological, what may be a problem, right? But many people find these experiences alarming and it means something bad about me. But we always push it to the green side of the virtuous cycle of the positive mental health, right? That in this case is normalizing and learning to test perceptions. And we have similar conceptualizations for the anxiety and affective lability, which have been kind of easier actually, because more have been done on that. We track the progress through the intervention with YETI, or Youth Experience Tracker instrument, that covers the 4 antecedents and in addition depression and sleep. These are inclusion-exclusion criteria, so age 9 to 21. The actual age of the included participants is 9 to 19. They tend to be clustered at the younger age as they are growing into the eligibility range. At the moment, we only offering it face-to-face, so we take those who are commutable distance within 1 hour drive from our centers, and to those who have 1 or more antecedents, and who gave the consent, which, like, I think we have 2 people in the entire 300 who said no, and they are outside the age range anyway. we don't require positive family history as inclusion. That helps with the blinding and otherwise, so if one of the controls has an antecedent, they are eligible for the intervention as well. And this is our progress so far. So we had 126 FORBO participants in the right age range who do not have severe mental illness yet at the time when we're considering them for intervention. Of these, 34 were eligible and randomly allocated. The main reason why someone was not eligible, they didn't have any one of the 4 antecedents. Half of them didn't have any one. The other exclusions were not within commutable distance or having received psychological treatment in the past 12 months. These people may still be allowed in next year if they still have an antecedent and did not receive psychological treatment more. And so we randomly allocated 34 of them. That's 17 to the intervention, 17 to the control group. So control group, we don't need to even let them know. They just keep follow-up in the cohort. Of those 17 who we offered them intervention, only 1 said no, I'm not interested straight away, and 2 did not complete the intervention. So they started, but after a couple of sessions didn't come back. But 14, and that's 82% of the 17, not just accepted, but they completed the intervention. So we defined it as attending at least 8 sessions of the intervention, and they continue to be followed up as in the FORBO cohort. In terms of results, they will take several years to come because we see already that the symptoms are improving, right? The antecedents, the little problems they're coming with, but it will take much longer before we see what this does to the actual incidence of mental illness and also many more participants. So that the main results will take years to come. What we know now is what participants tell us about the intervention. So we have many positive feedback from the parents. I wish I could have had such help when I was his age. It's a typical statement. We heard it from several families. And we have many good feedback from the youth participants. So my favorite is a girl who had social anxiety among other problems. She said after the intervention she changed and she could go to a good university rather than going to the university where she knew she would know everyone. And so it's already changing some decisions in people's lives. We have family who said, we saved 2 hours every day in our life because we don't need to drive around the harbor. We can cross the bridge now. Again, a case of anxiety. And so that makes us hopeful, the acceptability of this. So I conclude here, the 4 antecedents that we picked up based on literature only, they seem to predict effectively the onsets. We are more curious about how well they will predict as we go further with longer delay. That's actually the main aim. The psychological intervention that we designed that's very normative and coaching skill focused seems to be acceptable to the young people and to their families. It's well accepted, but the actual results will take a number of years to emerge. There is one immediate direction. There's a second intervention trial just funded. We just learned about funding the last month. And that will focus on the younger kids, age 3 to 6, to actually prevent an antecedent. In this case, we will try to prevent the transgenerational transmission of anxiety, and this will primarily focus on working with parents, essentially giving them a course of CBT for themselves, and then follow that by parenting intervention, so that they can apply the skills that help themselves to parenting in a way that will make their children more resilient. And I have many people to thank. This is a collective effort of large number of people. The FORBO team growing. Lynn McKenzie, one of the assessors, is here, and she will have talk in the next session. We have a number of people who are helping us, advising us, co-investigators people who come and train us on measures, and so thanks to everyone and the funders.
If we can hold any questions till the end, just because of time constraints right now. And we'll take our next speakers, who Maretta will introduce.
Yes, the next speakers will be two people. It's Nicoline Hemager and Camilla Cristiani. They are both PhD students in the VIA-7 study, and they have together they have been visiting Larry's unit. He was he was a very good host, and we are very happy about that. And now we will hear their presentation.
Thank you for coming, and thank you thank you to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to present our data in the company of such distinguished speakers as Dr. Ua and Dr. Seidman. My name is Nicoline Hemager, and this is my colleague Camilla Cristiani, and we come from the Danish High Risk and Resilience Study VIA-7, which Anne Thorup already told you about this morning. In this presentation, we will focus on preliminary baseline data on neurocognition, social cognition, social functioning, and language, and we have no disclosures.
The VIA-7 is a prospective cohort study with a baseline assessment of offspring schizophrenia and bipolar disorders 7 years of age. From other high-risk studies and birth control studies, we already know that offspring schizophrenia and bipolar disorder show impairments in different areas that are important for a healthy development. As illustrated on the slide here, inspired by INSEL 2010 and House 2014, earlier high-risk research have found vulnerability markers already in the perinatal period and early childhood before illness onset. Offspring schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in the ages up to 12 years have been described with impairments or deviances in the areas of motoric, cognitive, and emotional functioning. They have been described with lower psychosocial behavior and social functioning, and a higher rate of psychopathological development. So why doing another high-risk study? With the VIA-7 and to follow VIA-11, we hope to contribute to the further understanding of possible childhood vulnerability factors in the offspring schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But we also hope to get a better insight into how and also when to make a qualified early intervention with the aim of increasing life quality for the high-risk children and their families.
So this is a flowchart of the VIA-7 cohort. I'll just take you through it quickly. We have 522 children 7 years of age. Of these, 202 are children of parents with schizophrenia spectrum psychosis. We have 120 children of parents with bipolar disorder, and 200 are children of parents with no history of either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. In the familial high-risk schizophrenia group, we have 7 children with 2 parents with schizophrenia, and in the bipolar subgroup, we have 1 child with two parents with bipolar disorder. Also, we should mention that the control group is matched on the group of children with schizophrenia on age, gender, and zip code. The bipolar subgroup is a non-matched comparison group, but they don't differ significantly on those 3 parameters. And so how did we investigate the children in the VIA-7 cohort? You already heard about it this morning, but just want to repeat that we retrieved information from multiple sources. We did that first of all, by testing, interviewing, and observing the child itself. We did it by interviewing and testing the index parent as well as the primary caretaker, and we retrieved information from the school teacher in the shape of questionnaires. Also, we should mention that all child investigators were blinded of the high-risk status of the child throughout the investigation period.
One of the visions or goals in designing the VIA-7 was to capture and characterize many aspects of being a 7-year-old child with a familial high risk for developing schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Being able to include 522 children and at the same time do a very thorough assessment of many different domains in the child and of the child's daily life has been a challenge. But the opportunity to use the Danish registers to retrieve the data sample, but also the time and the patience from the children and their families, have made it possible to measure on so many domains. The many perspectives on the child are represented here on the slide in the purple boxes. We will focus on the preliminary results from the assessment of neurocognition, social cognition, language, and social functioning.
And so before I'll take you to the results of the neurocognitive measures, I will just give you a quick overview of the entire neurocognitive test battery. We have a total of 26 tests with more than 100 derived measures. You can see the various domains on the left, the test instruments in the middle, and the different test measures on your right. And since data analysis is not yet completed for the entire neurocognitive test battery, we will only show you analysis on the measures that are already completed. I will just quickly run you through the tests from which we are going to present data. First of all, we have the Reynolds Intellectual Screening Test, which is comprised of one verbal test called Guess What and one nonverbal test called Odd Item Out. And from this test, we derived an IQ estimate. Next, from the test of memory and learning, we have the word selective reminding test, where the child is given a list of 8 unrelated words, repeated over 6 different times, and asked to repeat until the list is learned. Then, after 30 minutes, without any previous warning, the child is asked to recall the list. And this test measures immediate and delayed recall. From the Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Battery, also known as the CANTAB, we have the spatial recognition memory test, where the child must remember and recognize 5 different locations of this box. And this test measures spatial recognition memory. Also, from the CANTAB battery, we have the Stockings of Cambridge test, which some of you might know as the Tower of London test. And in this, the child must plan how to move 3 balls efficiently around in order to match a given pattern. And this test measures planning efficiency. Also from the CANTAB, we have the spatial working memory test, where the child has to find a blue token in a series of displayed boxes and use the tokens to fill up an empty column, while not returning to boxes where a blue token has been previously found. And this test measures spatial working memory. Last, we have also from the CANTAB the rapid visual information processing test, where the child is asked to detect a sequence and to register responses using a press pad. And this measures sustained attention. So here are the results of the just mentioned neurocognitive measures. The results are presented in z-scores, and the control group is the reference group, which you see here is the green line. The children at familial high risk for schizophrenia are represented in dark purple, and the children at familial high risk for bipolar disorder is in the lighter purple color. And as you can see, the children at familial high risk for schizophrenia are showing significantly more deficits in these 4 areas, which is intelligence, attention, spatial memory, and spatial working memory compared to the control group, and also significant differences compared to the group of children at familial high risk for bipolar disorder. The children at familial high risk for bipolar disorder is in between the 2 groups, but there's no significant differences to the control group. And finally, we have these 3 tests, psychological measures, planning, and immediate verbal memory and delayed verbal memory, where we found no significant differences between any of the groups.
Moving to the assessment of social cognition in the children. From earlier studies, we know that social cognition is impaired in individuals with schizophrenia, and to a lesser extent also in individuals with bipolar disorder. Looking at clinical high-risk schizophrenia and high-risk offspring schizophrenia, the scientific picture presents mixed results. This might be due to the fact that social cognition is a multidimensional concept and it covers different processes. And research projects have used different assessment instruments and have focused on different aspects of social cognition. In 2008, the National Institute of Mental Health formulated 5 aspects of social cognition to be considered in research schizophrenia moving forward. The 5 areas were theory of mind, social perception and social knowledge, attributional biases, and emotional processing. In the VIA-7, we have focused on characterizing two aspects of social cognition, and that is theory of mind and emotion recognition as part of the emotional processing concept. And we assess theory of mind with two different tests. One is Have His Strange Story Revised, which is very used in autism research, and the other one is the animated triangles test. Both tests measures the child's ability to mentalize. Emotion recognition was measured with the emotion recognition test from the Cantab battery. The ERT is a computerized facial affect identification task, and it measures the child's ability to correctly identify between 6 different emotions displayed on a touch screen. And the face is shown very briefly, and the 6 emotions are happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and disgust. The total % correct is a measure of the child's performance on 180 pictures. And we are still in the process of analyzing data, but we would like to share some of the outcome from the ERT here. And as you can see on the slide, the same colors, the colors means the same as from Nicoline's presentation, that there's actually no difference between the offspring schizophrenia and offspring bipolar compared to the control group. So the results are that they don't show any impairment in their ability to do emotion recognition. We also assess language functioning with the TROC2 and the CCC2 questionnaire. The TROC2 is a visual test where the child has to listen to a sentence and then pick the picture that matches the sentence, and it measures receptive language skills. To complement that, we wanted to measure also expressive and pragmatic language skills in the child, and we do that with the CCC2. And the CCC2 is filled out by the teacher, and it measures language on 3 scales, a total scale and 2 composite scales, general communication and social interaction. We also assessed aspects of social functioning, and we did it with the Wineland and the SRS, which are both questionnaires. The Wineland was filled out by the parent and the SRS by the teacher. The teacher measures the child's social responsiveness, and it's a very used questionnaire in child psychiatry, and it focuses on the autistic-like problem behavior, whereas the Wineland measures typical social development. And the results regarding language, and this is the CCC2 checklist, it shows that there is a significant difference between the offspring schizophrenia and the control group on all scales, but there's no significant difference between the offspring bipolar and the control group. Okay, sorry. And the results from the social responsiveness scales shows us that both the offspring schizophrenia and bipolar disorder show significantly more deficits in their social responsiveness than the control group.
So in conclusion, these are preliminary baseline data on a quite young age group at familial high risk for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but already at this young age, the results are showing important significant differences compared to healthy controls. In some functions, we found what we expected, namely deficits in intelligence, attention, spatial recognition memory, spatial working memory, language, and social responsiveness in children at familial high risk for schizophrenia, and in the children at familial high risk for bipolar disorder, we found significant deficits in social responsiveness. At the same time, though, there are several functions where none of the 2 familial high risk groups show deficits compared to healthy controls, which is planning, verbal memory, and emotion recognition. Thus, a pattern of generalized cognitive impairment was not observed, which is noteworthy. Planned follow-up studies at 11 years of age and on will show whether the deficits of the 2 groups of children at familial high risk will remain stable or change. So some of the limitations of the studies, the sample size of the familial high risk group for bipolar disorder was not quite as large as the other 2 groups. And due to ethical reasons, we had to make interventions in cases of children who needed referral to psychiatric evaluation or social services due to various degrees of neglect. And finally, there's the possibility of selection bias and the question whether we only managed to recruit the best functioning high-risk families.
Yeah, and some thoughts about early intervention. When talking about intervention in offspring, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, at least two perspectives could be relevant. And the first perspective is a here and now support for the families, enhancing the daily life quality. This is maybe a more traditional psychological or psychosocial way of thinking about intervention, where the primary goal is to change the here and now with the here and now effect. The second perspective is intervention to prevent the transition into psychosis. And here the familial high-risk research could maybe contribute to the understanding of which areas are important to consider. What traits in the child that could be important to support with treatment, cognitive training, social skills training, psychotherapy, family-based intervention or support. In this perspective, it could be fruitful to look at the offspring with the worst impairments, despite of their diagnosis. And maybe we will have to develop criteria or cut-off criteria for the childhood years for being able to assign the most vulnerable group to treatment or early intervention. This is a way of looking at the familial high-risk group dimensionally rather than categorical, to look at the level of, for example, neurocognitive or social cognitive functioning in the child if we have a psychological perspective and not the diagnosis. So we be sure that we actually treat those who need treatment and not those who will develop into a normal pathway again.
And so we would like to close with thanking you for your attention and thanking all the VIA7 families, all the supervisors, our colleagues, and external collaborators. Thank you.
I think we should hold the questions to the end just so we have enough time. Thank you.
Yeah, and our last speaker is again our chairman, Larry Seidman, and he's speaking on behalf of Materi Keshavan, who sadly couldn't make it. We're looking forward to hear the talk.
Thank you. So I wasn't part of this study. Hopefully I will be able to represent it well. So Kesh trusted me to do it. So the notion that he developed here in this study, which was a post-hoc strategy for the Pittsburgh high-risk studies, which is one of the leading family high-risk studies over the last couple of decades, was based a bit on the Naples risk calculator. Perhaps some of you have seen this article, which came out online a number of months ago, where in a Naples study, we created an algorithm of 8 variables. And just like a risk calculator for prostate cancer, breast cancer, other kinds of illness, one can see these multivariate predictor algorithms and develop a calculator that some of them are online and so on. And so this is increasingly used in medicine. And to our knowledge, it was the first one used in psychiatry. So in that study, we found that one could determine an individual's risk by looking at their variables and where they fell on cognition, on certain symptoms, on social decline, and so on. So, and I think in Dr. Uher's talk, he had the same logic, a little bit of a different math, but simply taking a kind of binary approach, which I think is also fits very logically from a clinical point of view, saying, is this an antecedent that's abnormal or not? And then adding up the number of antecedents and selecting people into a clinical trial based on the antecedents. So I think, again, a similar logic. So Dr. Keshavan had the same idea. This is a paper that is in progress. I don't know that it's been submitted yet, but focusing on environment. And again, the other comparator is the polygenic risk score, where you're summarizing many risk variables. So I think this general strategy makes sense. So as we've talked about, many of the family high-risk studies, including the ones you've heard about today, show a variety of abnormalities. And generally, by the age of 7 to 12, you would say that somewhere between 25 and 50% of the children are abnormal in some area. Perhaps another half to 3/4, at least at that stage, are relatively free of problems. We've talked a lot also about how genetics and environmental factors interact, but we don't really have a good predictive algorithm for the later onset of psychosis in family high risk. We have one example from clinical high risk, and we'll have to see if that's replicated. In previous work from the Pittsburgh group, we've reported baseline measures of schizotypy and positive prodromal symptoms are highly predictive of later psychosis. And that was in Dr. Tandon's paper in 2013. And we hypothesized the combined effect of multiple environmental variables and phenotypic measures that would be better than any single measure in predicting. So from the literature, what Kesh did was summarize many of the variables you've heard today and calculate from those literatures an average odds ratio, which is a kind of effect size. And the variables that he chose were trauma and abuse, obstetrical complications, cannabis use, paternal age, and which has a lower effect size than the first three variables, season of birth, which also has a very marginally significant effect, and urbanicity. And these are the studies from which he drew upon those variables. So these were the 6 variables, environmental effects, that went into the risk algorithm. So the study goal, he had 3 goals. Could an aggregate score of exposure, which he termed the polyenvironmental risk score, could that predict conversion to psychosis in family high-risk adolescents? Whether combined use of premorbid measures would have a better predictive value than either alone, and would this specific algorithm be a stronger predictor of conversion than individual risk factors? So the Pittsburgh study is completed, and but is still being mined, and the main design, very similar, first-degree relatives, mainly offspring, but also siblings of people with schizophrenia spectrum disorders, age 18 to 22, both sexes. There are about 165 children that went into this study, and as you'll see, about 87 of them had enough follow-up data in which this study is based. So there was no psychotic disorder allowed at study baseline, very typical design feature. And then there were baseline and a number of follow-ups, I believe 3 follow-ups, neuropsychiatric, cognitive, and imaging assessments. So we've talked about the environmental risk factors, and various interviews were done. So what he did was a little bit more psychometrically complex than a binary decision. But for any individual subject, the risk score is the log of the odds ratio for that risk factor, where each person gets a yes or no on the risk factor. So the person might have been born in an urban area or not, or they might have been born during the winter or not, or had evidence of obstetrical complications or not. And depending, not everybody would have information on all variables. If you had all 6, the denominator would be 6. If you had 5, let's say 3 out of 5 were positive, you'd have 5 in the denominator. So an example that he gives is a 20-year-old man with a first episode of psychosis, has a history of cannabis use, is a minority but not an immigrant, was born in an urban setting, and was born in summer. Little is known about his obstetric or family history. So the PES score would be as follows. The log of the odds ratio for cannabis plus for minority status. The person was not an immigrant. You add the log of the odds ratio for urban birth. The person was born in summer, so they get a 0, and you divide by 5, and that gives you a score. And then you take the scores for all of the people in the study and look at them in relationship to conversion, predicting conversion, and looking at group comparisons. So the, let's see, individual risk factors trending for differing between converters and non-converters and the PS score were correlated with psychosis outcome using logistic regression, using race and sex as covariates. So the results. So the total sample was 83 subjects, 14 who converted to psychosis, which is a relatively high conversion rate for family studies. That's about 17–18%. And this was like the sample that I reported on earlier. This sample had, was perhaps not by design, but had low SES and had a lot of adversity in the environment in the data collection. So anyway, 14 with psychosis as an outcome, 69 without. The groups were comparable on their age at the consent. It's a relatively young age for this kind of study trying to predict conversion. The mean length of follow-up was no difference, no sex differences, and no race differences. The number of people who got repeat SCIDs, there were a number of missing subjects in this, but let's see, the proportions were largely the same in the two groups. And a number of people withdrew from the study, were lost to follow-up. Interestingly enough, they were all in those without psychosis. I'm not sure, since I didn't conduct this study, why that would be, but I have some ideas. What about the effects? So there was a significant effect on cannabis use. Now remember, these N's are pretty small. So the 5 subjects were 36% compared to 7% in the people who did not convert. The other variables that were trends, but again, these effect sizes are fairly large given the small sample size, was physical abuse, where you see a rate of 7 times higher in the psychosis outcome, and neglect 2.5 times higher. They're only marginal trends because of the small sample in the psychosis outcome group. Sexual abuse is very low incidence rate, no difference in the loss of parent or parental separation, which is actually high, but there were fairly large differences there, again, in favor of those with psychosis outcome. No difference in the urban birth or the older advanced paternal age idea. So a number of these factors seem quite relevant, and let's take a look at the association with the neuropsychological measures, so as well as symptom measures in association to conversion to psychosis. So the Chapman map, which is a scale from the psychosis risk scales of Chapman and Chapman. There are 4 or 5 of them. 3 of them were chosen. Magical ideation, which is some kind of odd thinking, and social anhedonia were significantly predictive, and this is not an uncommon finding. We've reported on that as well with physical anhedonia, for example. The CPT-IP, there were 2 versions given. In Barbara Kornblatt's CPT-IP, the verbal and nonverbal are matched for difficulty, which is interesting because that does allow you to compare the sensitivity. And in this sample, it's the verbal CPT, which are digits that were significantly predictive of conversion, fairly large effect size of 2.2. The nonverbal or spatial was not significant, even though it was a large effect size. The other trends were, they used the SIPs, and the positive subscale was a trend as well as the go, no go task. So a variety of measures, both clinical, neuropsych, and symptom, were associated with conversion versus non-conversion. And the question is, if you were to look at an algorithm where you're combining both the clinical, the neuropsych, and the polyenvironmental score, could you develop a stronger predictive algorithm? What they used was receiver operating characteristic metric, ROC curves, and the measure is the area under the curve. And what's interesting here is you see this is the polyenvironmental score. What you can see is this is rather high AUC, not good enough to be an individual prediction for psychosis by itself, although it's a respectable score. When you add the clinical, which was also quite high, you're starting to get it above 80, which starts becoming possibly usable in the clinic. So, and that's roughly comparable to what we found in the Naples prediction algorithm, and also Stefan Rohrman in the European study in predicting Prodrome. So this is actually interesting that you can come up with fairly comparable measures. These are somewhat different measures, and the question is, what's the best combination overall? As you can see, the sensitivity is relatively low. Specificity is very high, and that's very common in these kinds of studies. Positive predictive value is generally lower than a negative predictive value. But one would say this is promising. And again, this was a post hoc story. That is, they picked the variables. They didn't pick them and knowing who developed psychosis or not. But the study wasn't designed to test this question. And one might redesign it and maybe have a stronger finding. And this shows you the area under the curve for the combined measure. So anything to the left, and as you get out to this 90-degree angle, the closer you get, the better the prediction is. So tests like a test for HIV positivity, obviously you don't want to have a false positive test there, because tests carry enormous weight in terms of what they might mean to the person and various things you might do. You want to be really out here. So the question is, can test scores like this be clinically usable? And in a way, you need studies to actually determine the impact and see how usable they are. So let's see. In this case, I think what he did was, so similar to the risk calculator that we used, you have, we actually have continuous variables. Here it's 0 or 1. In this case, an individual's risk is calculated because they are positive on sexual abuse, cannabis use, neglect, and season of birth. So in a way, what we really want to do is, and I think Rudolph really demonstrated that in the selection criteria for the clinical trials, is have information that's not at the group data level, but brought to the individual. So if they want to know, my father has schizophrenia, what's my risk? You may or may not have the information to tell them, but that's much more of the ultimate goal. And of course, risk is not independent of treatment and environmental factors that can modify that risk. So it's not an invariant number that dooms a person. But people, I think we're going to be faced with this kind of challenge as we get better in our prediction. We'll be asked, well, how can we use it? So finally, just to summarize, a higher polyenvironmental risk score was significantly associated with conversion to psychosis. The odds ratio is certainly respectable of about 2. This combined multivariate model has a sensitivity that's low but certainly decent, and a specificity that's quite high. The sensitivity in the Prodrome studies is usually closer to about 40, and that's because the general conversion rate is higher. Combining family risk, multiple environmental risk factors, and premorbid phenotypic signatures might help better prediction of psychosis and thereby facilitate early intervention efforts. Limitations in this study include the small sample size, investigation of only a small number of risk factors. An additive model of environmental risk factors cannot be assumed, and potential interactions between risk factors were not investigated in this preliminary study, really. And the results should not be generalized beyond a familial high-risk paradigm. So in conclusions, future studies need to replicate these findings in independent, larger samples. It's possible, for example, in Dr. Uhr's study or in the VIA-7, that something like this could be done. And with multiple assessment points, you have a lot more statistical power to see the robustness of these predictors. To look at gene-environment interactions and also bring in neurobiological measures along with poly-environmental risk for prediction of future psychopathology. It's an open question. I guess the theory amongst many of us investigators is that having measures of stress hormones, brain imaging, and other biological measures, inflammatory measures, might, along with clinical measures, refine it and produce even better algorithms, but we don't know that until we test it. So thank you for your attention. So I think we've got 5 minutes. Now, we did have Pat McGorry was our discussant, but he seems not to be here, but we are happy, all of us, to take any questions that people have. So please feel free to ask myself or any of the other speakers.
Thank you very much. My question is to you, Rudolf Uhr. Maybe you told us, but how did you recruit the families? And what about those that were invited but did not participate? Do you know anything about them? So maybe you could elaborate on that.
So most of our participants are enrolled from clinical services for adults who screen, who systematically ask the parents, do you have children? And that's the mood disorders services and the psychosis services. And then the control families, they were recruited to match the high-risk clinical participants by going either to the same neighborhood, like neighbors, or then same schools in the areas. So they were enrolled through schools and through acquaintance methods.
And how many families say no thanks?
How many families say no thanks? It depends actually on diagnosis. We had very few refusals in the mood disorders referrals. And given the small number, we had quite a few refusals among the schizophrenia, the parents with schizophrenia. Overall, the agreement rate is good. It's around 90%. But in the group of parents with schizophrenia, it's low. It's more like 50-60%. So that's the one drawback, that we believe we're not just getting a small group of offspring of parents with schizophrenia, but also a less representative group, and we're trying to work on strategies to repair that.
Hello. I would like to ask about the results of the theory of mind, because you only showed us the emotion part of your research. What are the results? Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have the results from the animated triangles and the happy strange story yet. We just started data analysis like 3 weeks ago. So I just finished with the ERT, and I hope to get to present them in an article, soon, before Christmas maybe, yeah.
So the results are coming, but not yet.
More questions?
One question I wanted to ask, and this might be for both VIA-7 and for Rudolph's study. We've been experimenting, we've started a group of mothers essentially what we're calling the Parent Support Group. And this is being run by my colleague Cindy Liu, which is essentially a psychoeducational group that lasts 8 weeks for any parent who has with psychosis who has children. Because, and I think you mentioned this, or perhaps Anne mentioned it in this morning, one of the striking things that a lot of these parents say is, although I'm getting treatment, pretty good treatment, great treatment, nobody ever asks me. My clinician doesn't ask me about my role as a parent. Had you mentioned that, Anne? Yeah, which is a very striking gap. Have you some observations on that, Rudy?
It's data that I was not showing today, but we've done a study of needs of parents with severe mental illness, so not just schizophrenia. And the striking findings was things they're asking for, they're not getting is how do I communicate about mental illness with children? It was coming top. Mm-hmm. And how do I get care for myself in a way that I don't need to bring my children into the appointments. And on the point that you ask whether the clinicians take it into account at all, we've seen a gender divide.
We've seen
a gender divide, because when it's more pronounced with fathers. So we find that of the affected fathers, very often the treating clinician was not even aware they have children. With the mothers, they actually more often were either enrolled with reproductive mental health when they were pregnant and in the first year of their baby's life, or they work through it with their clinicians. The fathers, they are even more neglected than the mothers are.
Interesting.
I think we have a final question.
Thank you very much for the organization of the symposium. It's great, wonderful talks, wonderful samples. So the strategy here is to get more cases and enrich by psychopathology of the parents. I'm just wondering how much the risk factors that we are identifying would be useful for the general population. I mean, when you think about schizophrenia or bipolar, about 10%, perhaps 15% would come from families affected. How much would it change? And the other thing I was discussing with Rodolphe yesterday is you have a huge environmental risk factor when you have a father with schizophrenia, for example. So, I don't know, just perhaps the risk factors are not going to be exactly the same, because here the risk factor having somebody with severe mental disorder is for everybody, not for some of them.
Yeah, I could take a crack at that. Maybe Maretta or others will also. I know in our thinking, the question of how do you many of the risk factors that we're identifying are not necessarily specific to this population, and that's your point, and maybe risk factors in the population for psychiatric disorder, which is a much larger public health concern, of course, and that would be maybe in Scandinavia it could be done, I don't know, but a much more ambitious agenda. In my own thinking about early intervention and recognizing that yes, having a parental risk for psychosis is only found in about 10% of people who develop psychotic disorders, maybe 20% if you look at second-degree relatives. So, but still, if you could make a difference in those offspring of that subgroup, then you might be even improving the population incidence of the disorder, or a much less ambitious but perhaps much more realistic goal is improving their life, improving their experience and functioning. So I think it's just a strategic question of how do you, if you're working within a major mental illness context, where do you want to put your resources to try and do earlier intervention? And it's interesting, I remember running into Dr. Uher in a meeting of maybe 3 or 4 years ago. he was telling me about this idea. I was very excited because I had a similar idea. Maretta and her team had a similar idea, and so on. So there are a few groups out there who have thought, okay, maybe we'll only be able to influence a subset of people, but if we can, that's still a very important subset.
Yeah, definitely, it's massive. I'm just coming with this question because we are following up 6 to 12 years old that are at high risk for a general, it's kind of a heterogeneous thing, and with symptoms. And once we get there, we have a 3 years follow-up already, but we don't have the data analyzed yet. But we get this idea, Caspi's idea of this P factor, the general psychopathology, that would predict more than externalizing or internalizing. And I have the feeling that the prediction is going to be more general, very much in the what we are discussing in this symposium. It's not going to be that specific.
Yeah, no, I agree. And working with that kind of sample, you have an opportunity to have a much more variable kind of set of outcomes. We'll look forward to hearing about that study.
Yeah. Now we will have to close.
We better move out.
We better move out and get some coffee. And thank you to all the speakers and thank you to all the participants.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that went well.